Okay, and I should thank Rotary Club of Carnatic for this captive audience. You gave the state of total lockdown. This is truly a captive audience that we can talk about. And yet she rises again. I would like to talk about Madras, the tribulations that she underwent in the 400 years of her history, and how she got up every time and started running again. We have become a megapolis now, and some of this might be a little depressing to learn about the sadder parts of history of Madras, but it will also tell us how bigger burdens the city has borne than this corona, in the sense that we have got out of pandemics, cyclones, and whatnot. We have issues about bombing, war, tsunamis, water, pandemics, evacuations, cyclones, and scarcities. Let me start with the basic history of Madras. Madras city was never visualized with ambition by its founding fathers. At most, they planned a trading station, a factory, and a small fort by the sea. They thought about a population of, say, a few hundred. Their water needs were met by a few wells within the fort, and only 6-meter walls protected them. We have very ancient villages in the present Madras map, but Madras happens to be a colonial city, what the British founded, where the Fort St. George exists today. So we'll have to look at that part of the 400 years of this geography. The city has endured the worst of its times for 381 years and has emerged only stronger. And browsing through the history of the tribulations will tell us how much we have endured, and most of them greater dangers than corona. The last point is very important because most of these dangers have been several times more dangerous than corona, and we came out with a smile, or rather our ancestors came out with a smile. The founding the city, the year was 1639, Francis Day, Kogan, and Nagabhattan. Nagabhattan was a gunpowder mixer and who used to handle the guns, and he had lost 3 of his fingers on his right hand. He was the Indian guide for the Englishmen to start this city. What is today Madras was earlier just a sandy stretch of beach and 2 unnamed rivers. One river they named as the North River. It has vanished from the maps today. The other river, they didn't name it initially. They called it the Triplicane River, they called it the Pundamali River and the Chindathiri River, and finally it took a name, the Kuvam. The land grant was from the Pundamali Nayak, who was a subordinate of the Chandragiri Vijayanagar Empire. So this was 3 kilometers north of the Portuguese town of Santo, and a few 10 or 15 kilometers south of the Dutch in Pulicat. So for both of them, it was just a day's forced march, and they looked with an evil eye on Madras and the British. There was a sandbar on the sea 2 kilometers away, and so no ship could come to Madras beach, either in an emergency or for trade. The funny fact about this is, people always accused Francis Day of having a girlfriend in Santo, and that is why he chose this ineligible site of land for a fort. How true, we don't know, but there seems to be a fact that this wasn't a correct place for a fort or a trading station. The first danger to the city came 1 year down when the Vijayanagar Empire, or the remnants of the Vijayanagar Empire, Rangaraya, asked for the town back, and the British escaped that. Several times under siege by Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, Golconda, and there were so many wars fought. You can't count the number of battlefields that exist within Madras, now terribly overgrown with buildings and other things. We had a fort, we had a battlefield near the Katipara Junction, which is now a polo ground. We had one in MRC Nagar, and almost every road of Kacheri Road or Santom had a battle in it. And there are some names of roads that are very interesting. There's a road called Powder Mill Road off Kacheri Road in Mylapore. People would imagine it to be face powder or some masala powder, but it is actually gunpowder. The gunpowder was being made in a street off Mylapore, and the road still is called Powder Mill Road. The most serious challenge was in 1746. Fort St. George and Madras were captured by the French under General La Bourdonnais. he had a set of ships, an armada of ships outside Madras, and he was throwing cannonballs at the fort and missing most of them. But then one shot, lucky for the French, fell on the tavern. Tavern is the equivalent of a Tasmac shop. So it fell on the tavern and opened the doors, and the people, all the besieged people, they felt they should have a drink, a couple of drinks, and a few more drinks, and finally the fort had to surrender. So a few years down the line, say 3 years to be more precise, Britain got back Madras in a swap for a Canadian town of Louisburg. So the only time Madras has ever fallen was to the French, and even the British did not capture it back. It was got back in an exchange. So there's a town called Louisburg in Nova Scotia in Canada, for which Madras was exchanged. Who would think the question of Austrian succession, the succession of an emperor or empress in Austria, would play a role in the history of Madras? Yet it did. That was the time all European powers got together and said whoever had captured the other's territory should return it. So the British returned Louisburg in lieu of Madras. The American War of Independence was in a way triggered by this giving of Louisburg back to the French, because the people had spent a lot in capturing Louisburg, and they did not like it being exchanged for an Asian town. And never again would Madras change hands till 1947, when the tricolour was hoisted. When the British came back, they realized that the fort had been crowded around by the native huts, and they could not visualize an enemy coming from afar. So they needed an esplanade. You can find the word esplanade in a lot of towns: Penang, Singapore, Calcutta, Madras. Esplanade is an open space around the fort, which gives you an easy view of the enemy, which Madras did not have the luxury of. So the first major danger to the civilian areas of Madras came as soon as the British got back to Madras fort. They demolished the entire Black Town. The Black Town then was where the High Court, the Law College, where the Raja Annamalai Mandram, the Madras Medical College, the Reserve Bank. This was where the Black Town was, and all these were demolished, including the temples. And the British forced the Indians to move 4 roads away. And this was the first time that the entire civilian population lost their homes, they lost their temples, lost their communal spaces. And how did the British enforce that they did not build again here? The obelisks, the only surviving obelisks. They did something like 13 obelisks. This is next to the Parry building. You can still see it. It is being maintained by the Parry. The earlier one was on the Broadway, which has been swallowed by a building right now, or broken down. These obelisks warned the Indians not to build beyond this. In my opinion, if this city of Madras, this lovely city of Madras, had to be abandoned by the people and the population, it had to be because of the water scarcity. That was the gravest danger the city has ever faced. Because the original planners did not plan for a huge population. They had a few hundreds inside, and the wells were enough. The struggle for good water to drink has plagued the city ever since its founding days. And today, filling a few pots of water from the water lorry leaves an average Chennai puffed with pride. So this is something that has been happening to us for 400 years. This is the Seven Wells building, the compound rather, which you can see very close to Stanley Hospital in the corner of the Mint Street. As early as 1750s, the water reserve for the fort became a problem. The water in the fort wells had turned brackish because of overdrawing, naturally because of a higher population. The British identified a spot in North Peddanayak and Pet, now at the end of the Mint Street, and they commissioned the digging of 7 wells. This area is still called 7 wells because it was very important. Till our dams came, these 7 wells sustained the thirst of Madras. Water from these wells were raised manually by picotas, or called atrams in Tamil, and into cisterns under the wall of the Fort St. George. They were piped for 2 kilometers from Seven Wells area. And this is perhaps the earliest piped water supplies in Asia, and perhaps the world too. And incidentally, when Hyder Ali could not capture Madras, he tried to poison these wells with dead animals, the carcasses of dead animals, so that the city would come bent on its knees. But luckily, the wells were protected by an Anglo-Indian family and did not happen. Madras population doubled in 1940s. Madras doesn't grow by birth of babies, okay? It grows by migration of people who are looking to the land of gold. And Madras has always attracted migrants like a magnet. And that's why the population doubles in a decade or goes up very fast, offering a challenge to the planners. Tanker supply, we imagine, happened in the 90s and the 2000s, but water tanker supplies happened as early as 1950s and has been sustained from there. This is an emergency water supply scheme in 1954. So we see long queues and metal kodams. We don't have plastic kodams at that time. So this is the first dam that sustained Madras. The year, if you see above, that yellow plaque is 1868. This was less than 9 years after the Sepoy Mutiny, and North India was still under big tension, and the British monarchy had taken over the country. But in 1868, Madras was building its first dam around the Kosasthala Yar in Thamaripakam, and a canal took those water into Red Hills Lake. And today, there are several dams all around Madras built in successive droughts and famines. But today, even water comes from 300 kilometers away in the famous Chola Lake of Veeranam or the Krishna River to sustain the city. So this city is basically on survival. It knows all the ways how it can survive. I'm sure 1,000 years down the line, it would have become like Rome or London and still continue to survive. One piece of trivia along with the water problem. The LIC caught fire in 1975 during the emergency. Madras was reeling under a very big drought. There was not a drop of water in the fire engines. So at one point, the fire department said, we can't, they shrugged and said, and threw up their hands and said, we can't save this building, let it burn down. There's little we can do. And there's an engineer in the fire department who came up with the idea, why can't we use the Coombe water for putting out the fire? And that's exactly what they did. The Coombe is just a few hundred meters across the road, and they took the water from Coombe via tankers and put out the fire. So we were willing to lose the landmark building that we once had, the tallest building in India. For 7 years, it was the tallest building in India. And we were willing to let it burn down because we did not have water. Madras, we'll go on to the next topic, which is the wars. And Madras is the only city in India that was attacked both in World War I and World War II. And by very distant enemies, Germany and Japan. The picture is of the SMS Emden. You would all be familiar with the name by now. In 1916, the World War I was across the world, and the First World War, and many millions from Asia were employed in the armies of Europe. And so Madras was a legitimate target for the Germans. But they did not believe that Madras could be attacked so far away from Germany. The planes were not so too established. A majority of there was what you call a blackout in Madras. They were ordered to put down the lights. But unfortunately, it was also Navaratri day. The city was very well lit. And most of the people who had to be at their post defending the city were sitting in the clubs and parties when the German light cruiser SMS Emden came within 2 kilometers of the city and hurled 130 shells on Madras. The city was unsuspecting, and we suddenly had 100 fires going up in all parts of the cities. The longest fire was in the Anglo-Persian liquid fuel tanks in the harbor, but walls over in across Madras had huge holes like this where the shrapnel had hit. This is the sailing club, and the roof had holes because it was very close to the sea. Shrapnel hit the court. Just look at the very wide variety of places where the shrapnel hit. The court, the sailing club, General Hospital, Veperi, Hados Road, Punamali High Road, Royapuram, Casa Major Road, and Georgetown. And there was a lot of smoke and fires going on in these places for a day or two. The city was scared out of its wits. People wanted, there were rumors that the governor had run away, the British government had run away, and people wanted to move out. There were not too many automobiles or buses or trains, and so people wanted to go out as well. And the government actually had to print that there were no televisions to assure you like today, and the government printed songbooks where it had employed poets and write poems about how strong the British Empire was. On the other hand, the local people braving the private censorship, the government had called all newspapers papers privately and told them don't publish too much of news about this. But then the private public also published books on this. One book that you see is Germania Gundal Patanath Janangal Padavikum Sindhu. The Sindhu was like a type of poetry on which they explained how the public were suffering. This plaque you can see, the number 2 picture, is on the wall of the High Court, where a portion of the wall was broken by one of these bombs. Madras was the jewel in the crown for the British. They did not expect this attack. It shamed them. The British wanted to avenge the insult and chase the Emden. They lost a lot of fine ships battling against this terror, but the Emden, which had bullied weaker ships all its life, met its match. Not here, but very close to Australia and the North Keeling Island and the Cocos Archipelago. The Emden had traveled 56,000 kilometers during the war and sent a lot of fine ships down to the seabed. But its attack on Madras was what caused its destruction finally. I am not going chronologically, I am going along with events, similar events. So the next day, the big war event in Madras was the Japanese bomb some 30 years later, 1942-43. Singapore had fallen to the Japanese. Singapore was a major base for the Allied powers. When Singapore fell to the Japanese, the Allied camp shifted to Madras and Avadi, to be specific. The people of Madras did not know what was happening in Avadi. In 1946, after the end of the war, a lot of journalists were taken to Avadi and shown how something like 20,000 soldiers, 3 airfields, 2 cinema theaters, 3 swimming pools, a private railway track inside, all these survived in that area between Pattabhiram and Avadi. I'm still told that the railway track takes a bend, a detour, so as not to hit this, because it was late during that time. The local people did not know about the camp, but they did not know why, and that is why they did not know why that the Japanese were trying to attack Madras fervently. The British went all over in arming Madras for the theatre of war in the Far East, and seaplanes, the Catalina seaplanes, used to land in Red Hills Lake. There were airfields all over Madras. One of these airfields was even used for your Sholavaram racetrack much later. And with the Tambaram or the Meenambakam, everything was made into Royal Air Force tracks. A lot of British and American troops were in Madras. We get a lot of photographs from the American soldier photographers who came to Madras at that time, which pinpoint to us to their history. The Japanese concentrated on attacking Madras and other towns nearby. Colombo and Kakinada had been attacked, and an ARP is called an Air Raid Patrol. So it was organized as a government civilian link up so that there could be a lot of coordination in the defense. So the ARP put up advertisements in the newspaper saying Japan declares war, Madras now in the war area, and said it is hoped our passive defense will receive impetus. It is not too late to train. And finally it says Madras must not burn. So Madras not burning due to the Japanese Axis powers was very important to the British, because this is where they were giving their last stand after most of Far East Asia had fallen to the Japanese. So on the left you see the trench, 22 kilometers of trenches were dug in Madras. So they could have thousands of people there. People are told that when air raid warning wailed, if in a building, stay there. If in the open, take care in the nearest building or go to the nearest street slit trench. Don't move until the raiders' fast is sound. And how alarming it could be to the local people if, just like your coronavirus today that people hand out, people are given this chart to recognize if the enemy was overflying or it was a friendly aircraft. It caused a lot of alarm in the city. If people dropped a vessel in the kitchen, half a dozen people would have a heart attack. Every flying bird was suspect. So that was the terror that Madras underwent in the 1942-43 period. The biggest disaster was shooting the zoo. How many of you know that the entire Madras Zoo was shot, not by the enemy, but by friendly fire, the Malabar police. The reason, I'll get to the story. Madras has a long tradition of exhibiting animals. The initial zoo was in the museum compound. That is how we know of the Veer College and Satya College and Veer College. And people, after this, had moved to the People's Park next to the compound of the central station today. And the managers in the corporation were worried, what if a stray bomb hits the zoo and opens up the zoo? Wild animals will be let loose on a unsuspecting population. This problem was not unique to Madras. Every city in the world faced it. With a big zoo and the scare of bombing, faced this. Berlin Zoo was bombed by the Royal Air Force, and wild animals had to be shot street to street by their police. And then, luckily, it didn't happen in India, but in other places, even like England, pets had to be put to sleep because there was not enough food for them. So 500,000 pets were killed in England during those last weeks of the war. So in Madras, what happened? When they decided, the mayor, Chakrai Chetty, spoke to a lot of zoos in India, asking that whether they would take these animals for free. But most of them faced the same problem. They didn't have feed, they didn't have the security from bombing, so why should they take it? Erode agreed to take it, but they said they would take it in a week. But the order to shoot the animals came. 3 lions, 6 lionesses, 4 tigers, 8 leopards, 4 bears and a black panther were shot in a matter of an hour. Elephants were not shot because perhaps they didn't have enough labor. Most people had run away. They didn't have enough labor to dig a grave for it. For accounting purposes, the invaluable population of the zoo was accounted at 4,568 rupees. This is just a small trivia. But that accounting system, how much we had lost, was never really reflected in this account. A big chunk of the Madras population ran away. This is a real watercolor. This is in USA right now. But this painting was done in Madras, and this and another painting was of people escaping a war-torn Madras on bullock carts. The evacuation perhaps was the greatest danger that ever faced Madras. People in large number felt that the city would be bombed to smithereens by the Japanese, and they had to escape as well. It was not safe to live, they thought. So they were tired of blackouts and mock air raids exercises, false alarms. So they thought they had to run away. And at one point, the British government went along with them and said, you shift from exposed positions. And government sent an advice to city firms and banks, move out. What the government meant was exposed positions was the beach road, where all the commercial and the government capital was there. The beach seemed to be the first point of invasion. So officers shifted inside. Even the collector shifted to the building called the Cloisters. A lot of people would not know the Cloisters is still the Commerce Department of the Stella Maris College. And the building still exists. The Tahsildar moved, and the City Civil Court moved, Madras GPO moved, and for those who live in Mylapore, the Reserve Bank Treasury section moved to where the Kamadhenu Theatre was. At that time, the officers moving were not encouraging to the common public. They were seeing the government running for shelter. So they thought the villages would be safer. This is a cartoon, but Madras never loses its sense of humor. When you look at the number of memes and the number of jokes that you get about coronavirus, and you still laugh at it. Sometimes I think it is not the way we should handle problems. But even then, and there was a danger of a Japanese bomb, and there's a danger of scarcities. Magazines like the Jagan Mohini ran a cartoon of an overweight girl being pushed into an overcrowded train leaving Madras. It says Madras to Tiruchirappalli. And this is a magazine, Jagan Mohini, was run by a very popular Tamil writer called Vaimu Kodanaigi. I will just give you a small trivia, though not associated with this talk. Vaimu Kodanaigi was illiterate when she wrote her first novel. Then she learned Tamil and went on to write 115 more novels, and also edited this magazine of Jagan Mohini. What would you do when you want to run away from your house? You take your valuables, count your children, and find a way of leaving the city. But you also need to lock your house. In the late 30s, there were only around 50 lock-making units in Dindigul. And locks were not being imported from Japan because Japan was at war. Non-availability of locks delayed the departure of many Madrasis who got nervous every moment. The price of locks went sky high, and there was a new breed of brigands who specialized in stealing locks. They would steal the locks from one place and sell it to somebody else who unsuspectingly bought it and lock it into their house only to lose it in a day or two. I think one of these voices is not muted. There are two roads, the Kundratur road from Porur and the Bangalore highway, which the government differentiated for slow and fast moving traffic. They wanted people to go out. And a consequence, rent set up in other places. And Kumbakonam actually reports in the Indian Express saying that the rent has gone up there, sequel to the exodus from Madras. This is Kruvila Jacob, who was the principal of the MCC school then. He would send a letter to the parents asking them not to fear Japanese, be courageous, and also pay the next few months of school fees in advance. So that is how careful people were being. We are repeating history, just like it was told in the earlier introduction about Santa Ana saying, those who forget the lessons of history are forced to repeat it. You don't have to forget them. They will get repeated even if you don't forget. So the school fees asking you to be paid in advance. And even library books, the Madras University Library said return the tickets and return the books as if it was primary for a city that was going to be bombed. And what happened finally? Madras was bombed just one day. It was 1943. And the irony was, this is a part of the bomb which is in the museum, the Fort Museum rather. And finally, when the bomb fell, ironically, nobody knew in the city. There was a cyclone going on, there was a power cut, and there was no alarm, raid warning alarms going on. And it came in the newspaper 3-4 days later because of the censorship. And people realized that Madras had been bombed. The bombs fell harmlessly north of the fort, between the Reserve Bank and the fort, and a few sheep were killed, and a shepherd was hurt. So that is what happened when, after 3 years, it became such a big anticlimax that no bombs hurt Madras. But more than the bomb or the fear of the city being suffering, the early part of 1940s was perpetual scarcities. From Madras not being, Madras will not burn, the slogan became Madras will not starve. War disrupts manufacturing and supply lines. Scarcities are felt by the population, hoarding happens. So the ARP, the Air Raid Precautions Group, once again linked to the TUCS, which still exists today, the Triplicane cooperative stores, and they set up rationing. The ration cards that we have today as are the basis of our citizenship they were first given in the 1940s. Once again, weddings. What happened to weddings, which are big events in the 1940s, just like they are now? People were going on the newspapers and advertising, asking friends and guests not to come for the wedding. They said, please post your greetings or send a telegram. I am not in a position to issue invitations or relations because the upper limit was 30. So the closest family could attend the wedding. This advertisement is from P.T. Rajan, who was one of the leading politicians of those days. He himself could not invite more than 30 people. And this could have been the real climax of this scarcity. The city contemplated banning idlis because it contained too much of resources. 2,000 bags of black gram were needed for the city, but only 70 bags were coming in. And vadais, bondas, idlis, and dosais were taken off the menus. A neighboring state of the royal state of Cochin actually banned idlis. And there were lots of rumors that idlis were going to be banned in Madras. But then finally, good times came back again. And this dish that represents Madras did not move off our plates. The other major thing that has really affected our diets even today, wheat was introduced. People did not like wheat. The Madrasis did not like wheat. And wheat was being imported as well as moved from the north. But food tastes of the people were not very easy to change. So the corporation gave free cooking demonstrations on street corners. They even claimed that wheat was more nutritious than rice, which everybody will tell you which is wrong. And also two dishes that you are very familiar with, Rava Idli and Godumai Dosais, were invented during this period. Godumai Dosai, of course, in Madras, and Rava Idli in Bangalore. We had a sort of small demonetization-like problem way back then because the copper in the coin, the first I should tell you that the copper, an army is a glutton for metals, and you need metals for everything from wiring to planes to even your bullet, your shells had to be lined with copper so that they will not foul the guns. And the copper prices shot up because mines were also not accessible from South America. So people realized that the intrinsic copper inside a coin was more valuable than the value of the coin. So they started hoarding it. Suddenly there was a scarcity of coins, and people, very rich people, only used to handle notes those days. Coin was the main currency, and the government cracked down on people who were hoarding coins. They gave rewards to people who were complaining about this, and they even finally they could not succeed. And finally, the Water Yana came, where this hole in the middle of the coin takes away its weight. It was also a period when railways were actually advertising in the newspapers, asking people not to travel, asking people to retrospect whether the last journey you made was necessary. And finally they said, if you have nothing to do, don't do it traveling, stay at home. Exactly what we are getting today. But what made the railways say this was because most of the railways was being used for the war effort. And number two, many of the Indian engines had been sent to Mesopotamia for the war effort. And the railways did not even have enough engines to shunt the carriages in the station. They had enough engines only to run the trains, and they used elephants. They employed elephants throughout India. They used elephants to shunt the carriages into the required tracks. Shortages came in everything. People were asked to use car tires more often, and the big danger to car tires was these bullock shoes. People who have seen bullocks pulling carts know that they can't walk on tar roads, and you have to have metal shoes horned onto their hoofs. And these sometimes would get loose and be on the streets. They used to be sharp, and they used to tear the tires. So the government actually encourages children and Boy Scouts throughout the presidency to pick up these shoes. They give a reward. And the Boy Scouts, they're very, very smart. They break a shoe into two parts and claim two rewards. And the government finds this, and after a week or so, they said rewards will be given only to full shoes. Petrol also was rationed. This is a petrol rationing order in 1941, motor spirit ration book. So you have to produce this if you want to fill gas in your car. And one major event that even determines a lot of our lives and politics thereafter happened. Most of the film came from Japan or Germany, and most of them were cut off during the war. The government wanted all the film for its war effort and propaganda films, and they said they capped the limit of films to 11,000 feet. Earlier films used to be 18,000 to 20,000 feet and have 55 songs, 60 songs. So when it became 11,000 feet, most of these musicals vanished. People had to reinvent themselves to make new movies. And a lot of people who could not sing and were just acting as extras, like a person called M.G. Ramachandran, got their chances thereafter. When this cinema turned to people who could act otherwise than act and then singing. So a lot of people like M. Karunanidhi, who wrote scripts for valiant scripts for these king-type movies, ancient movies, they all came into the forefront and got into politics later and changed the history of Tamil Nadu thereafter. Finally, on scarcities, even matchboxes were scarce and were rationed. So you could go to your ration shop and buy only 3 matchboxes. The war happened in the 1940s, but Madras was always in the forefront of the famine. Famine was usual in Madras till the 1950s. We have not heard of a famine in the 1960s or 70s or 80s or 90s. The food security is much, much stronger now. Crop failure, locust attack, which is happening right now again, and export to England of the grain made our Madras presidency much more vulnerable to famine. During 1877 and 1878, we had a very big famine in Madras, and the British government actually moved grain by ships. The trains were not too established then. These are early photographs of grain bags on the Madras beach. And these could not be distributed to people. They were made into gruel so that more people got gruel or kanji, which were more people were to get a share of their carbohydrates. So a lot of kanji totis and by charities and the government came up across the presidency, and The most famous Kanji Totti in Madras was the Monegar Chowdhury, which is exactly next to your Stanley Hospital. And there's actually Manyakar Chowdhury, which became anglicized to Monegar Chowdhury. And a hospital was constructed here, which became Stanley Hospital much later. And there used to be a rule in Monegar Chowdhury that old people will be looked after, but once they die, their bodies will be donated to the Stanley Hospital for dissection. I don't know whether this rule still stands. And famines have been frequent, but every time the city has been made rations to all people and introduced projects that could enable people to earn their rice. So this is the Buckingham Canal, the early photograph of the Buckingham Canal. During 1877 and 1878, this 8-kilometer stretch linking the Adayar and Coombe River was built at the cost of 33,000 pounds, which was given mostly as grain and rice as famine relief work. The canal was named the Buckingham Canal in 1878 because it was built on the orders of the governor, who was the Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. So the Buckingham Canal still exists today. And Madras is a migrant town. There is no order in town planning. It is crowded. It was always prone to epidemics, not just today, but all along its street was prone to epidemics, which it always shouldered because of overcrowding and sanitary conditions. The main diseases that affected Madras were tuberculosis, cholera, plague, and influenza, which came in waves till medicine was invented. And so too to corona, we'll have a medicine by a few months, so nothing to fear. This photograph was the tuberculosis sanatorium in Tambaram, and the doctor who looked after this doctor actually treated the mathematician Ramanujam Saveri, treated or in anglicized Chowri, who treated Ramanujam in England for tuberculosis. So this sanatorium station today is all that we know, but there was a sanatorium which would isolate the word, look at the word, the key word, isolate and quarantine people who had tuberculosis. It didn't affect the common man or people. Actually, cholera affected the Britishers more. We even lost one of our most popular and the best governors we ever had, Monroe, who actually introduced reforms even in Tirupati and Mantralayam, who is reported to have seen Raghavendra himself when he walked into the Mantralayam too. And perhaps he is well remembered and will be the last standing colonial statue in Madras. When we have taken away all the other kings and queens in Madras, Monroe will be remembered and the statue will still be there, because Monroe is still revered in lots of parts of the old Madras presidency. He's called Monroe Park. He did so much of good to the state, but he also died of cholera when he was touring Guti. And a lot of British administrators lost their life in the 30s and 40s, both good and bad, of course, in the 30s and 40s of their age when cholera hit them. Some of the Britishers never ever had a resistance to the cholera which the Indians developed. This is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale, perhaps the most famous nurse in the world, never visited Madras, but she had Madras very close to her heart. We don't know why. We don't know the connection. And she was a very close friend of the governor, Napier, Lord Napier. And she tried to convince the governor that an underground drainage system should come in Madras, or the drainage would start killing people by pandemics and epidemics. And her advice was taken, and drainage was formed in Madras. But then she used to call these as vapors coming from the Coombe. She knew about the Coombe. She talked about the Coombe and said that the bad effects of the Coombe drainage was going to hurt the city. So one thing is, let us not feel guilty for dirtying the Coombe now. It is not us or our fathers. The Coombe was dirty even in 1850s. So she said the Coombe was going to cause a lot of trouble, and inspired by her, some, I should call them idiots in the British government, thought that the Coombe should be filled from the Spurtank Road, turned and connected to the Adayar. But luckily better sense prevailed and the Coombe was not filled. This is a Mysore princess, and we have records that say a Mysore royal wedding was stopped by the Madras presidency government so that the bride could get vaccinated. So we are talking about 1800s, and Madras was on a vaccination spree. Madras was one of the earliest cities to accept vaccination. This was mainly because of a collector of Madras called Francis White Ellis. Ellis was a multitasker. He was one of the earliest people who could write, Britishers who could write Tamil poetry. He settled down in Madras, in the college in Madras. The college in Madras is that education building where you have the Madras Literary Society. The college road is not named after WCC. WCC incidentally came there in the 1900s. The original college was this department of DAPR there, where you have the library of Madras Literary Society. Ellis translated a lot of Thirukkural. He also was very convinced of vaccination as a cure or a prevention for smallpox. So, but vaccination was a very, very, cumbersome thing to do those days. So just not like an injection. So Ellis had to convince the Indians, particularly the Hindus, that the cowpox virus, which was used as an inoculum for the injection, was also a holy thing. So he wrote a poem, which he lists, a traditional list of the Panchakavyam, the milk, butter, yogurt, urine, and dung, which are considered holy by the Hindus. He said the cow worship should also consider the sixth boon, which is a smallpox vaccination, and which was coming from the cowpox virus. So, how far a government authority, a Britishman, could go? He wrote a poem. It was a forgery. He claimed that the ancient Hindus had written a poem talking about vaccination, and that Hindus should also get vaccinated today. This was happening in the 1830s. This is the only surviving building within the Madras College. It's a library now that was built later. You should definitely visit this and get a feel of what the Madras College used to be. Madras is one of the very few places which has a statue for a vaccinator. Shows you the focus that we had on health and pandemics. This statue you can find in Pudupet, very close to the old Chitra Theatre, next to the Darwin booth. The Swami Nayak of Pudupet was a neighbor of Pachima Budali. And you can also look at the instruments that he used for vaccinating. He was actually a nobleman, almost like a Zamindar, who was an assistant of Ellis. Ellis used him to vaccinate a lot of people. In fact, people thought he was doing witchcraft. So Swami Nayak was beaten up by a group of Armenians, and lots of other people also looked at him with distaste because he was a vaccinator. But they pursued this vaccination. That is the mode that they put the city into. Self-preservation, vaccination. We were very much ahead into medicine, much ahead of the rest of the developed world. And the same ethos will save us this time too. This is a familiar quiz question that most of you would have heard by now. Why was Vivekananda stopped from entering Madras? So you will have a lot of different political answers to this. Vivekananda actually traveled in a ship from plague-ridden Calcutta to Madras. So the government said the ship cannot embark. So Vivekananda actually, he gave a sermon from the ship, and all his disciples on boats around listened on the bobbing seas and listened to him. And finally, he even loaded a pot of Ganges water, which is still retained in the Ramakrishna mission. So as early as 1900, the city knew about quarantine rules. One of the important factors about health of Madras, 50% of the Madras, constituting the females of Madras, would not go to a doctor, would rather die because the doctor was male. So it was the British in Madras who realized that women had to be admitted in the medical college. Doctors had to come out and serve the women population. So this photograph is of Mary Scarlett, perhaps one of the earliest women MDs in the world. She did her equivalent of MBBS in Madras Medical College and did her MD part of it in the Medical College for Women in London. She was very early. But what was happening during this time in the rest of the medical colleges in Madras and in the world? Women were admitted, but there were riots going on. The famous lecture hall riot in Edinburgh, the male students protested by the female admissions by even letting in a lamp, which was the mascot of the college, into the lecture hall. When there were riots, Madras was admitting women and educating them. Today, in any medical college, you will find that women outnumber men as students. But it all started when Mary Scarlett joined the medical college. The first thing that her professor said was, I cannot prevent you walking through the halls of this college, but I will not teach you. But he passed out as a doctor. This was a major event that happened in the medical history of Madras. We'll come to the next part, which is cyclone and floods. Madras is a cyclone-prone area, which Francis Day did not take into account. What exactly happened was, The contract for Madras was signed in Pudupalli, and they were gathering the material for building the fort. 2 ships were anchored off the coast of Madras. Even before the British built a fort here, they lost 2 ships to a cyclone. The vessel was called Eagle and Unity, and 1639. This was the first ships to be lost on the Madras road, because as the sea was called. And cyclones, one per decade or so, or more frequent, was battering Madras seas and sinking ships. The worst disaster was in 1782, when 100 native sea craft, which had come to Madras with rice to feed the famine-hit population, was sunk by the cyclones. Madras is basically a flat terrain, and that is why it floods. Water doesn't run off. It is not a hilly terrain or something. So that is why cyclone and floods are very well associated. And it's not only the flat terrain, it is also human greed that enables you to be flooded every year in October. Some of your best known landmarks are sitting on lakes. Your entire Tinagar sits on a lake, the Loyola College sits on a lake, your Vallur sits on a lake, your IIT sits on a lake, your CLRI sits on a lake. So whenever the Madras wants to build something new, they close down a lake and build it. These lakes are very important resources as flood tackling sources or for drinking water. So you find reminders of this long tank where this arrow points to it. The long tank is where Tinagar, Nungambakam is. You find the only reminders are the lake area, Tank Bund Road, Lakeview Road. This lake was actually 5.5 miles wide, 1.5 miles thick, and it was a western border of Madras. But in 1923, the Justice Party government wanted 1,600 acres to form the Mambalam housing use scheme, which gave you Tyagaraja Nagar, Tinagar. But the reclamation went on. 1941, 54 acres were reclaimed from the lake area and Loyola College campus as a part of it. So after 1941, we should look at how Madras handles floods, because the biggest water shed has gone. This is the 1943 flood, and these cyclones are very, very cunning creatures. The Madras Meteorological Laboratory was shifting to a new observatory in Meenambakam. So there was no warning to Madras in 1943. The Kuvam and the Adayar actually merged due to the rains. It was such a big rain, and this was the first major flood after the lake closed, and it did havoc. This was the same flood that we talked about during the Japanese bombing of Madras, and people did not get to know even that they had been bombed. The much awaited Japanese bomber, they did not know about, because this flood had cut their lifelines. 1966. A lot of these old people in Madras in the 60s would remember, up to the 70s would remember this wrecked ship on the beach. This is the Marina Beach, and the Stemat is a Liberian ship which had brought wheat under the PL 480 scheme. Actually, it was hit by the cyclone, and it drifted, lost its anchor, and grounded on the Marina Beach. People tried to free it out. They used winches and they tried to take it out, but they could not manage. And what exactly happened was, it became a mass of rust, and a lot of swimmers used to lose their lives. On Pongal 1983, on the Kanam Pongal day, 19 dead people were washed ashore because they had been cut to pieces by this ship. The ship finally in 1990, the government made a very big effort and took it on shore and sold it for scrap. We all lived through the 2015 floods. Rivers remember how the river Adayar reclaimed most of its territory that we had already lost. So 2015 was a hugely man-made flood, the late opening of the Chembrapakam shutters, and more importantly, building the runway, the new runway which is not being used by the pilots today, across the Adayar River. Madras is one of the very few cities in the world which has an airport, which a runway runs over a major river. Though the Adayar is only 32 kilometers long, in 2015, the water was funneled through the bridge on the airport and hit like an arrow across the city, flooding the entire city. But we lived through it. We got out of this. And we have the tsunami, the 2004 tsunami. The ancient Tamil epic Manimekalai says, "Let the beautiful city be destroyed by the sea. Pugar is ruined. As the sea flowed over the large city like Indra with long lance-wielding hands, the king has departed from thence, and only the uprising waves have engulfed our noble Pugar." So the legend of a tsunami is in Tamil literature for several years. The Manimeghalai and Silappatikaram mentioned it. Poonpugar used to be the commercial capital of the Cholas, and for some time its political capital. It was lost to the sea. But 2004 was least expected to hit Madras, and it started from Indonesia, as we all know. The tsunami varied in height from 2 meters to 10 meters, and survivors were very few when hit by the direct wave. The 13-kilometer Marina Beach and the Elliott's Beach were flooded, was battered by the tsunami. But we should realize one important feature. If the tsunami had come 150 years back, Madras would have been wiped off. Because of the simple reason there was no beach. The Madras beach is perhaps the biggest man-made element in the city of Madras. The tsunami actually traveled 2.5 kilometers in its inland in Karaikal. It would have done exactly the same thing in Madras, because before 1880s, Madras did not have a beach. In fact, the sea used to encroach as far as Broadway, and the British had to build a 14-foot wall across. It's called the Bulwark, and remnants of the wall are still near the Reserve Bank of India. The British had to build a wall to stop the seawater from coming in and flooding the city on normal days. If it happened on normal days, what would have happened if the tsunami struck? You can see the waves on the picture here. The beach was a very small sandy strip of 10 feet or 15 feet, and some places the beach road ran exactly next to the water. And once the harbor, how did we form the beach? You should know about that. Sand accretion happens. Sand accretion happens when a harbor is built. So the Madras harbor was built in the 1870s or so, and sand started accretion to the coast. You can still see this happening on the Coom mouth, where you see big land movers digging out the soil to let the water enter the sea. So beach enjoys accretion of south of the harbor, and north there is actually an erosion, which is why Rayapuram is getting eroded. And since 1937, the beach has been growing at 1 meter a year. A very rare event when people are talking about global warming and rising sea levels. The Madras beach still keeps growing as a protection towards tsunamis, perhaps, while the rest of the world is losing its beaches. So in a gist, I talked about a lot of negative things that happened to Madras. But what is the positive thing? A combination of luck, perseverance, and hard work has brought Madras to what it is today. The city has grown in size, numbers, and wealth consistently after each debacle that it faces. Like a rubber ball, it has bounced back from every type of disaster, every form of adversity, and every shape of enemies that you can find in history. People consider Madras to be safe, and its population has doubled within a decade. A population doubling within a decade is a big challenge to demographers and planners. The population of Madras has doubled within a decade, almost twice the previous century. This is an ultimate vote of confidence a migrant gives. A migrant comes and settles in Madras because it is safe, it is a place where he can save his family and succeed in life. What we are facing now, the corona, the COVID-19, is one of the long lists of adverse conditions that has tried to put us down. But it is very, very small. It stands nowhere near what tuberculosis did, or cholera did, or your World War did. Your death rates are very, very less, your damage rates are very, very less, but I think we get depressed by the flood of information that we get. It is just a matter of time before all this fades away from the city and the memories of the human mind and our mind. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, your grandchildren will need a lot of historians like me to remind them of these grave lockdowns, the Kabasura Kudineer, and the webinars that we all had to undergo during these trying times of 3 to 4 months. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Your talk was very, very captivating.